Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for the Central Policy Forum. For those who I haven't met before, I'm Sterling Hinchliffe, and I've been involved in policy formation and policy activities around the party for not quite 25 years, and it's so great to see so many familiar faces and good friends and new people who I haven't had a chance to meet before to be part of this discussion around housing affordability and the challenges that we have in the state and in the nation. So I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, the land on which we gather, the Turrbal people on the north side of the river and the Yagara people here on the south side of the river, and also extend the apologies from Anthony Chisholm, our State Secretary, who was sent home today and not feeling very well, and to prevent him from spreading disease to a keen staff here at the ALP. But I also want to, on your behalf, welcome Peter Bentley and thank him for joining us to be part of this discussion and in fact lead this discussion around housing affordability and the challenges of meeting a grave need in our community. One of the things that makes the biggest difference in people's lives and their life outcomes is housing. It's very, very difficult, clearly, for children growing up in a household where they don't have they don't have housing stability to be able to make the best of the opportunities, the educational opportunities that they have. It's clearly difficult for a family unit to stay together and function well when housing stresses are pulling them from pillar to post, whether it is about where they're living from day to day or from week to week or year to year, or indeed how they're paying for that housing. So these are fundamental issues that need to be acknowledged and need to be wrestled with by the ALP. So that's why it's great to have some of our key people engaged in the fight here with us tonight. So I want to acknowledge Fiona McNamara, our candidate in Brisbane at the federal election, and also Evan Moorhead, the Assistant State Secretary, who's been able to join us as well. So let's jump into it. Let's talk around those issues of housing affordability and affordable housing, two concepts that can be slightly different in what they mean, because we want to cover the gamut. This isn't just about an affordable house affordable roof over the heads of people in the community who are stressed and engaged and challenged by a whole lot of economic circumstances. It's also about making sure that housing for the average lower middle class person is attainable and achievable, and that it's not just about rental housing, it's also about affordability of houses for purchase. So this is a broad gamut of issues that we can discuss as part of this conversation. And Peter Bentley and the group that he represents, he's the chief executive of the McKell Institute, have done a lot of great work in this field. For those of you who don't know, the McKell Institute is about 12 months old now. It's based in New South Wales, and it takes its name from that great New South Wales Premier, William McKell, who was a great champion of bringing people together and delivering a consensus model of governing the state of New South Wales, and was very successful for Labor for a very long period of time as a result. So in that spirit, the McKell Institute was created last year to bring that spirit of consensus and policy drive into the space of the think tanks that we hear about so much on the news talk shows these days. So Peter has been a driver of that. He's been a particular driver on this issue. The policy work that's been done around housing by the McKell Institute was their lead piece of work, and has in fact been something that they've continued to contribute to the debate around for a period of time. Now, a lot of the issues that Peter's going to raise have a particular sharp emphasis for New South Wales, but I think we can help Peter in the conversation that we have tonight about learning about how these experiences will have impact in jurisdictions like Queensland as well. So To get the conversation going, let me invite Peter up to make a presentation around these issues of housing affordability and affordable housing. Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Sterling, and just want to acknowledge as well the role that you've played in Queensland, both as a Minister for Infrastructure and Planning, and I actually was just remarking, and it must be the first time I've been to Brisbane in about a year or so. I came through the tunnel on the way from the airport and remarked to the cab driver what a wonderful piece of infrastructure it was, and he said, it's fantastic for the cabs, we get straight through, but there's not enough cars on it. But guys, thank you very much for having me along tonight, and as Sterling mentioned, we established the McKell Institute in New South Wales about 12 months ago, and really with the goal of focusing on practical policy issues that really touch everyday Australians' lives. And as we were undergoing that process, before we launched, naturally we were discussing the topic of our first report and speaking to family and speaking to friends and various people involved in the Institute. We said, what should we do a report on? What should we look at? The unanimous response was housing affordability. People said, if you could play but some small role in focusing on this issue and focusing public debate, and also potentially coming up with some solutions, you would make a real contribution. So a year ago, we launched this report, our first report, Homes for All, and when we first sat down with the authors, we said, in terms of promoting this, it'd be a great idea if we could have maybe 5 recommendations, 5 big recommendations to fix housing affordability, and they kind of all agreed and said, okay. Halfway through the drafting, they came back and they said, there's more than 5 challenges, we might have to go to 10. We eventually got to 20, and it eventually became Homes for All, the 40 things we can do to improve affordability and supply, and we're acknowledging the opening paragraphs that these are but 40 of many other challenges. What I'd like to do tonight is really start a discussion and spend about 20 minutes just covering some issues to really get your views, and then I'd be really keen to both get your views on the Queensland and Brisbane housing challenges, but also some provocative ideas that I'd like to put to you as leaders within Brisbane to kind of consider and contemplate. Sterling touched on the fact that housing isn't a peripheral issue. Housing is one of the 3 needs. We talk about food, water and shelter. If a significant proportion of Brisbane's residents or Queensland's residents didn't have clean water, there'd be riots on the streets. If a significant proportion didn't have regular access to fresh food, there'd be anarchy. And yet, a significant proportion of Brisbane and Queensland residents don't have access to affordable housing. We often talk about affordable housing and housing affordability. One of the things that we've really championed in our work and discussion is the fact that there's just one housing cycle. And I put to you as policymakers to really think about housing as just one cycle. We get into, in public policy, the kind of silo challenge that we kind of say, well, there's housing affordability and that's the private sector. And then there's affordable housing and that might be subsidised housing, and then there's public or social housing and that's state run. I disagree. There is just one housing market and it absolutely interacts with each other. So what we have is a state of affairs where, as private sector housing becomes more expensive, people are priced out of the market. Families that 20 or 30 years ago would have been able to afford to buy a reasonable sized home can no longer do so. So they either downsize to a flat or a smaller dwelling, or if they have a large family and they need a backyard, they rent. What that does is adds people into the rental market. In Brisbane, you have a rental vacancy rate of about 1.8%. Now, as a standard sort of metric, a 3% rental vacancy rate is generally considered to be the right balance, where you have tenants and you have landlords are essentially negotiating on a level playing field. When you have a rental vacancy rate that's almost half of that, and we have a almost identical rental vacancy rate in Sydney as well, you have a state of affairs where the landlords hold all the cards. You have a state of affairs where you might have 20, 30, you might have hundreds of people applying for the one particular apartment. So landlords discriminate. Obviously not on gender or race or anything like that, but they discriminate on economic circumstances. And who could blame them? So they will generally pick a couple that perhaps don't have children and don't have pets and both have incomes. So people that don't fall into that category, single parents, single students, will be left behind. We then see that flow on from rental, low rental vacancies. That then puts pressure on social housing and affordable housing. And looking at, I was looking at the figures in Brisbane and Queensland as I was coming up, and social housing in Queensland has a waiting list of about 25,000 people. So you have more and more people looking for social housing and affordable housing. Now the tragic and end result of this is those that can't get into social and emergency housing do one of two things. They're either put up in hostels, they're put up in hotel accommodation on a short-term basis, in many cases families, or in some tragic circumstances that they're forced onto the street. And we have people in this nation in 2013 either sleeping rough or sleeping in severely overcrowded homes because we are not providing one of those fundamental needs, shelter. In Brisbane, we've seen in the last 5 years a 33% increase in house prices. So the median house price in real terms has gone up by about $100,000. The average house in Brisbane is now about $438,000. The average unit in Brisbane is now about $346,000, and that's about a 25% increase in the last 5 years. One of the main challenges, one of the main reasons we've seen those increases is you in Brisbane, you in Queensland, are not building enough homes, just as we in Sydney and we in New South Wales are not building enough homes. The National Supply Council estimates that by 2015, it's in 2 years' time, Queensland will have a projected home shortfall of 107,000 homes. So the end result is young people, people on low incomes, single parents particularly, don't have accommodation, don't have homes. And if there is a more core labour value, a more pressing social justice issue than ensuring that people that are vulnerable, people that are disadvantaged, people that need assistance from people such as yourselves as policy leaders and from government, I can't think of one. So what I'd like to speak to you tonight, and I guess in some senses get your thoughts and challenge your views, is what I believe we need is a new civic discourse when it comes to housing and housing affordability. Now, I've mentioned the housing cycle. In our report, we identified 40 things that we say directly impact housing affordability, make housing unaffordable. And of those 40, about 35 are absolutely relevant to Brisbane and Queensland. And many of you know them: stamp duty, upfront costs for people that are buying new homes, infrastructure levies, and that was something the previous government actually capped and did a really good job in putting some downward pressure on that. The challenges with a whole range of financing behind housing, and one of the big ones is negative gearing. It's the elephant in the room. Now this is a tax policy that essentially creates demand in a housing market where we're not providing enough supply. Now this is also a tax policy which Paul Keating tried and backed down from. So a challenge that is so vexed that the great reformer Paul Keating walked away from is truly a monumental challenge for public policy and for policy analysts. There are a whole range of different issues, but I put it to you that if we want to see serious change in this space, it's actually about us. It's actually about each and every one of you. It's actually about the community changing the way we look at housing and providing permission to our politicians and to our leaders to take drastic action. So how do we look at housing? Well, and I'm interested to get your views about Brisbane and Queensland, but I would not be surprised if they're not too dissimilar to Sydney and New South Wales. We talk about housing in two ways: in a positive sense, about house prices going up, which is a good thing for everyone that owns a home, we say. And we talk about it in a negative sense: overdevelopment. We need to stop overdevelopment. Developer greed. Community need, not developer greed, we kind of chant. And we have in Sydney organised hit squads of community action groups that the second a proposal to build new homes in any suburb is put forward, they're out there campaigning against it. This will destroy our community. This will change the face of our local suburb. No, 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 no. That's one of the reasons we've got to the stage where we haven't provided enough homes. But as I mentioned, the people that are missing out, the youth, people under 35, in Sydney, 2/3 of people under 35 can't afford to buy a home. So they generally stay at home or they rent. The figures are not too dissimilar up here in Brisbane and in Queensland. Low-income families, the most vulnerable in our community are the people that miss out. And in order to shift that prism and start a new civic discourse on housing, we actually need to shift it from always saying no to new development. We need to shift it from always celebrating when we hear the property prices have gone up, and shift it to a conversation about how we're going to provide homes for our children, how we're going to provide homes for people that need them. And I think one of the key elements of that is really having a frank civic discourse about the opportunities and the benefits of growth. The opportunity cost when we say no to new homes being built in our communities. As you're all aware, when new homes are proposed, when DAs are put forward, we're all aware of the negatives, the environmental impact, the social impact. We see that, and we should. We should never dismiss that. But too seldom do we look at the opportunity cost of not putting in new homes. Too seldom do we look at what we're missing out on. So let me mention a few things, and I'm sure I'll miss some because there are many. Some of the opportunity costs, well, firstly, there's a social opportunity cost. When children come of age and want to move out, they can't afford to live near their parents. They can't afford to live in the same suburb. So they're relegated either to the fringes of the city, they're relegated to maybe Ipswich or down to the Gold Coast commuting, or they just up and leave. They move elsewhere. So all of a sudden there's a social disconnect because of the high cost of housing. That then becomes an economic disconnect because this becomes a productivity issue as the next generation that we need to be taking jobs, starting small businesses, serving us, making our coffees, teaching our children, providing us with medical assistance, all of a sudden aren't necessarily here. We have a major challenge in Sydney with key workers being nurses, teachers, police officers, that areas with extremely expensive housing, particularly the eastern suburbs and the North Shore in Sydney, can't get these people to serve in their community because they can't afford to. They can't afford to live in those communities. This then becomes a significant economic challenge as the young people and the next generation are moving elsewhere. And fundamentally, and something I know you all understand and as members of the Labor Party believing, is the social justice element. These are the people that are most in need of assistance from policymakers and from government being left behind. Now, that's the opportunity cost. There's actually a benefit in starting a new dialogue and talking about housing in a different way. What is that? Well, when we build new homes, we have more people. Now, that's often spoken about in a negative. More pressure on infrastructure, more pressure on transport, more people taking my car park at the local shops. That needs to be managed, but that, if done well, can be an extreme positive, because growth and managed growth is how we deliver services as a government, and how infrastructure and services, both from government and the private sector, are delivered to communities. If you have more people in a community, all of a sudden the business case for building a new road or building a light rail piece of infrastructure becomes viable. All of a sudden childcare centres and GP clinics and services that the private sector might provide start appearing because there's a business case for them. In Sydney, in the last few months, the state government's announced a light rail line which they're building from the CBD to Randwick, to the University of New South Wales. One of the key drivers behind that, Randwick Council, the Randwick region, and for those of you that know, it is essentially kind of Randwick down to Port Botany, has been the highest council to deliver the most number of homes in the last 5 years in Sydney. They've consistently exceeded their targets and goals in terms of housing delivery. And as a result, there's a viable business case to build light rail to there. Other communities, such as the North Shore in Sydney, Mossman, which has consistently rejected new homes and has consistently missed all of its targets, can't expect any infrastructure, can't expect a light rail because there aren't enough people to make that a viable case. These are the sorts of discussions, the benefits of managed growth that we should be having. And I guess in looking at it as activists and leaders within the Queensland Labor Party, I thought of Chris Bowen, the Immigration Minister, who recently resigned, but in his resignation speech he spoke about Labor being the party that gets both opportunity and growth. And he said, you know, the Greens get opportunity, but they won't accept growth. The Liberals get growth, but they don't accept opportunity, or they don't understand opportunity. They don't see the need to bring everyone with a community and a society. The Labor Party is the one party that gets both and can actually manage both. And I put it to you that in the housing space, when it comes to housing affordability, this is the party that can manage this issue, that can really lead this new civic discourse that supports growth, that supports providing new homes for people in order to provide infrastructure, in order to provide services, and in order to make sure we're not leaving people behind, while also managing that. And I caveat, I'm not calling for skyscrapers on every corner. I'm not saying, invite the White Shoe Brigade from the Bjorky-Peterson years to come back. This is not a call for that. This is a call to establish that growth and to do it in a manageable way. And one of the things in our report we called for, which really kind of captivated the imagination of some policy thinkers in Sydney, was a call for a return to terrace housing. So we essentially said, we need to build more homes. Sydney has a massive deficit and we're not building enough homes, but we accept that the solution isn't always a skyscraper on every corner. Let's look at terrace housing, because in Sydney, as in Brisbane, we have so many quarter-acre blocks, built post-war, that have huge backyards and aren't necessarily all being used. Now, for every quarter-acre block, standard home on the quarter-acre block, you can knock that down and build 3 terrace houses on the same footprint, providing 3 homes for 3 families in middle inner ring suburbs and in an affordable way. One of the densest suburbs in Sydney is actually Paddington. And any of you that know Paddington or have been to Paddington, it's a gorgeous suburb. People want to live there. It's extremely expensive, but there's not a single skyscraper in sight. It's all workers' cottages, terrace housing. That is an innovative way that we can increase growth, increase density, without destroying communities, without scarring the landscape. And there are so many others, but this really goes to the point, and I guess in some ways throwing the gauntlet to all of you as leaders within this area to kind of consider ways that we can be achieving those objectives without destroying our communities, without fundamentally kind of changing the landscape of our suburbs. I believe that we've actually hit a tipping point, that we're actually in the process of hitting a tipping point when it comes to housing. Why do I say that? Well, we kind of spoke about housing in this report and have done since as housing insiders and housing outsiders. And the housing insiders are people that own their own homes and they like property values going up. I'm one of them. I don't blame them. They like negative gearing because they've potentially bought 1 or 2 other investment properties and are doing quite well out of it. Again, I don't blame anyone for doing that. I've absolutely said if negative gearing's still around in 5 or 10 years and I can afford to, I'll do it too. You'd be a mug not to. But as a housing insider, those objectives generally are completely opposed to housing outsiders, people that don't own their own homes, people that can't afford to get into the market. Now, we're seeing more and more low-income families, single parents, but more importantly, in a political sense, as a voting constituency, pretty much anyone under 35 that lives in a major capital city that is finding it difficult to either buy a home or rent a home. This demographic are now starting to speak up and their voices are now starting to be heard. A journalist in Melbourne 2 weeks ago wrote a simple op-ed attacking the baby boomers and saying, you damn baby boomers, you had everything so well and I can't afford to buy a house now. That was shared by 15,000 people. He was invited onto TV talk shows and radio talk shows to discuss this literally 600 words that he'd written. It really hit a nerve. So we've actually, I believe, hit a tipping point in this debate where politically, over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years, those that are out there talking about this issue and providing real solutions will be rewarded by the voting public. And I disagree with this particular chap with his op-ed only in the sense that I think as he called them, the baby boomers homeowners are actually coming around on this issue too, for the very simple reason, as I mentioned, with opportunity cost. We're now seeing more and more people whose children can't afford to live near them, whose children are moving interstate or moving away. And so we actually have another fragmentation, essentially, of the housing insiders, people that own their own homes, that are looking at this issue and saying this is not sustainable. We need to be doing something. Even if you disagree with me on the political tipping point analysis, I think you will agree with me as members of the Labor Party that are passionate about social justice, that care about those sorts of issues, that this is an agenda to look after the most vulnerable in our community that we should all be a part of, and we should all be thinking about, and we should all be discussing. And as I say, we've put forward a range of issues, contentious and controversial, including abolishing negative gearing, abolishing stamp duty. We at the Institute are strong supporters of a land tax, which we believe will essentially drive right-sizing in terms of homes, because instead of just hitting people up front with a stamp duty, you're paying a small annual fee, and if you're living in a large block of land and not fully utilising it, then you might move to a smaller apartment. I use my grandmother as an example, who's lived in a 6-bedroom house on a double block for 30 years by herself. Why would she move? She's paying nothing in terms of land tax now, other than standard council rates. And if she does move, she pays stamp duty when she downsizes. Whereas if we had a state of affairs where we had a land tax and there was an incentive for her to downsize and move to accommodation that's probably more appropriate, she may well have done that 30 years ago, and a family could have been there for that period of time. We've raised a whole range of issues, and I'm sure many of you have views, and I'd be very keen to discuss them. The point is not who's right or wrong on these particular policy solutions or instruments. My broader point, and I guess request for your consideration, is really changing the civic dialogue that we're having, really reframing this whole debate, looking at potential solutions, but most importantly, trying to balance that opportunity and growth. And I think if we do that, then not only can we be making a very positive contribution to public debate, but more importantly, we'll be looking after the very people that we kind of seek to in a left of centre party. So I'll leave my remarks at that, but thank you very much for your time.
What I might do is we'll keep going on the conversation. There's a few things I'd be keen to respond to Peter on, and then I'll facilitate those people who want to add to the conversation. For a start, I think Peter's made some really good points there about some sacred cows, and I might add a couple to the list as well. I think I would agree with Peter that the better way of dealing with this particular issue around dealing with underutilisation of properties and what I think is a misallocation of investment in our economy would be better dealt with the proposal made by the McKell Institute around that land tax that has a greater reach and has an ability to encourage different decision making around housing use and property use. But one of the other things that does contribute to that we need to be conscious of is, and put in place for appropriate and I think sound reasons historically, but the allowance that the family home is not regarded as an asset for the purposes of welfare in terms of particularly the age pension, has driven, I think, a misallocation of resources. So we have so many people, without knowing the details of Peter's grandmother's circumstances, for example, Peter's grandmother, in a very large and very likely very valuable property, but not utilising it to the fullest extent. And that, I believe, also isn't just an issue in terms of housing, it's also an issue in terms of the economy, because where would the many hundreds of thousands of older Australians who are living in larger, and in fact, you see a lot of older people who, when they retire, actually move into a bigger house because they want to use their money up use their assets in a family home that can't be assessed as an asset against their entitlements. And where would they be allocating their resources if they weren't having that asset in the family home? Hopefully they'd be investing in other things in the economy, potentially including in expanding housing in the rental market. And that's what brings us back to our other sacred cow there around negative gearing, which I certainly think is something that has over time created a whole range of perverse outcomes. The final thing I'll make mention of in terms of Peter's challenge to everyone to think differently about these issues and these objectives. I think that example that Peter gave around the proposal and the support for the reintroduction of terrace housing in Sydney. We have got some experience of that here in Queensland with work that the previous government undertook in relation to the development of the Urban Land Development Authority, where we have encouraged and demonstrated better and more efficient ways of delivering housing to a lot of local governments and in fact to the industry across Queensland. If any of you have a chance to go and visit Fitzgibbon Chase, development that was effectively undertaken by the Queensland government at Fitzgibbon, Tagan, near Castledine. For anyone who knows it, you can get off Castledine station at the train station, have a wander around. There you'll see some very, very suburban and green environment, which has significantly denser housing, but isn't the cheek by jowl, roll out project developer type housing that unfortunately we've come to expect in that sort of space. And it has some things like what's termed in the industry as Fonzie flats. So a Fonzie flat is, obviously a reasonable sized family home, but there is, as a separate dwelling, there's a studio apartment above the garage that can be used within the house for older children, or when the time is right, turned into a separate property that's then rented separately or even sold separately. So there's all sorts of flexible accommodation models that can suit our traditional suburban environment and not have to be the tower blocks that Peter was talking about as well. So I think there are some good things that we've done in this space. But I'll leave that particular point on this particular statistic. This statistic dates from 2010. From 1980 to 2010, here in Queensland, we saw the average property size, the average square meterage of a home in Queensland double. At the same time, we saw the average household size go from 2.6 people to 1.9 people. So as a community, we've made some choices, and I would argue that the property industry has forced some choices upon us, but we've made some choices around wanting bigger homes that we are using less. Now, some of that is demographic factors, and some of that is fed into by those factors I mentioned earlier about older people in smaller households hanging on to, and in fact even expanding the size of their home property. But a significant element of that has also been the industry promoting and pushing a larger size property, and that's where one of the things that we did actually at a former government try and do something about is a covenants issue as well, and I'll throw that in there as something that someone might want to raise along the way.